Dunne.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to start by adding my thanks to the Chair of the Backbench Business Committee and the members of his committee. It's good to see him in his place, for agreeing to the proposal which I and the Honourable Member for Bristol North East, the Chair of the Business, Energy Industrial Strategy Committee, and my honourable friends, the Member for Kingswood and the Member for Hitchin and Harpenden, who both respectively chair the all-party parliamentary groups for the environment and net zero, for supporting the opportunity to have this debate today to discuss the government's spending plans for action on climate change and decarbonisation. It's a timely day for this debate, not least given the publication last week of the Climate Change Committee's annual progress report to Parliament for 2022. And my committee, and it's good to see members of my committee in the chamber, and I hope they'll have an opportunity to catch your eye during this short debate. We will be discussing the report in more detail with the chair of the CCC next week, but its headline message was unarguable. There are major gaps, some might say failures, in the programmes designed to deliver the UK's climate goals. And I'm sorry to have to say that. I sympathise with my right honourable friend, the Minister, who will be responding to this debate. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has disrupted energy supplies and has enormously exacerbated the demand pressures as economies recovered from the pandemic. But the scale of the current geopolitical crisis and the shock it has delivered to global energy markets clearly requires rapid recalibration of his department's strategy. Mr Deputy Speaker, it is not the topic of this debate, so I shall not refer to it in detail, but the cost of living crisis to which the current price shock has contributed is affecting us all. The House will shortly have an opportunity to discuss the government's legislative proposals on that issue later this evening. But it provides an important backdrop to the House's consideration of the priorities for government expenditure. There is a cost of living crisis which is making daily life extremely difficult for all of our constituents, including the most vulnerable. Happily.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. He's talking about the recalibration that is needed in the department. Would he agree with me that one area where that is extremely true would be in the need for a proper home insulation programme, which we've still never seen this government get right, in spite of the 11.7 billion allocated to the Energy Bills Support Scheme, which is of course welcome. What we need to see is that proper home insulation programme, street by street, local authority led, and we still don't have it.
The Honourable Lady makes a very important point and made a strong contribution to our committee's report, inquiry into the energy efficiency in existing homes, and I will be coming on to comment on that in my remarks as well, but I broadly agree with that. It is right that the government does what it can to align its spending priorities to support all of those who are being squeezed. But as the CCC reminded us last week, we are also in a future of living crisis. Large-scale changes in climatic conditions are undeniable, and they have the potential to make parts of the globe uninhabitable, provoking a crisis of barely imaginable severity. So it is entirely appropriate in this net zero week that the House consider in a little more detail the spending which the lead department on net zero is proposing in the current financial year to tackle climate change and to address decarbonisation of the economy. In October last year, just before the COP26 conference in Glasgow, the government produced its net zero strategy. And this is an ambitious document ranging widely across all areas of government. And it presents the first wide-ranging plan across government to build on the initial 10-point plan for the Green Industrial Revolution, which the Prime Minister had presented in November 2020. It demonstrates that the government is in the business of climate mitigation and climate adaptation for the long term. And I would argue that there is a broad consensus across the parties in this House that this has to be the direction of travel. It reflects also the broad scientific consensus that the planet is under threat from climate change as never before in recorded history, and that our behaviour must change in certain ways if we're to be able to avoid the worst effects. But my concern is that the government's strategy seems in too many areas to defer substantive action and leaves real expenditure to a future date. and dare I say it, possibly to a future electoral cycle. The warning from the Committee on Climate Change last week surely demands that more immediate action is taken to achieve the government's priorities and its net zero ambition. In my committee, we had an interesting exchange last week with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. He disagreed with the thrust of the CCC's conclusions, which he thought did not make sufficient allowance for the potential contribution of technology to mitigation of the climate crisis. And this is a perfectly reasonable debating point. Indeed, our committee has looked at a number of technologies that can play their part in achieving our net zero ambition. But I would say gently to the Treasury bench that waiting for the right technology to turn up is not a strategy. We've been looking at these potential solutions to help decarbonise the economy, from tidal power to offshore wind, where there's a significant emphasis in the government's strategy, and to heat pumps, where there is an ambition but a significant gap in delivery at present. The Business Secretary and the Energy Minister will know, because we wrote to them about this, that the current state of development of negative emissions technologies does not promise a silver bullet from carbon capture and storage plants, which will, by 2050, snatch the carbon from the air and allow us all to go on as before. It's simply not there yet. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Chancellor's spending review last autumn gave a breakdown of the government's expected expenditure on net zero measures in each year to 2024-25. In total, the government plans to spend £25.6 billion on net zero measures over this period, with £5.5 billion to be spent in the current financial year, subject, of course, to the House's approval of these spending plans tomorrow. There are concerns around how effective this spending will be, and the Public Accounts Committee has recently been critical about the overall funding of the net zero transition. I think the House is right to be concerned about the value for money of the approaches, and I commend the National Audit Office for its detailed and expert analysis of the government's plans. The excellent briefing on the Department's estimate produced by the House of Commons Library for this debate indicates that £21.8 billion, 20% of the Department's budget for this year, is dedicated to reducing UK greenhouse gas emissions to net zero. And I do not include in this figure the £11.6 billion for reduction in energy bills announced as part of the government's measures to address the cost of living crisis. Although the government lists it as a measure contributing to the net zero target, I do not think that, frankly, short-term energy bill reductions should really be treated as a net zero measure unless somehow they are linked to fossil fuel reduction measures more directly. So I'd like to focus the remainder of my brief remarks this evening on the points that my committee made last session in its report on energy efficiency of existing homes, which the Honourable Lady referred to. It seems to me that this is the area where the greatest progress can be made towards the net zero target and in the shortest time. And this was also the area which many witnesses before our committee identified as a missing component from the recent energy security strategy. I was pleased to see that late last month ministers laid before Parliament the draft legislation needed to implement the fourth Energy Company Obligation Scheme. This hugely successful scheme has driven energy efficiency improvements in a great many domestic properties, and these improvements will reduce consumer bills, but will also reduce energy consumption and thereby emissions from power generation. In the 9 years of operation of the scheme to date, it has supported cavity wall insulation in over 1 million properties. This is impressive, but we have to remember that there are still some 19 million homes which need upgrading to the Energy Performance Certificate Band C, and the cost estimate which our committee had received evidence on averaged £18,000 per property. Our committee, I'm afraid, found that the government estimate for decarbonising Britain's housing stock by 2050 of some £65 billion overall was highly likely to be a significant underestimate. Welcome though this ECO is, and the chair of E.ON told us last month about industry support for the scheme, it represents only a small fraction of what is genuinely necessary to achieve domestic energy efficiency. So I have to ask the Minister whether he will be in a position to elaborate further on what the Department's plans are to drive energy efficiency in existing homes. It's not immediately apparent in the spending plans the House is examining this afternoon. It is unlikely that the average householder will be able to afford a one-off payment of around £20,000 to upgrade their property without some incentive from the centre. I don't want to hark back to the Green Homes Grant Voucher Scheme, but I hope the Government has learned the lessons from its introduction. It was a well-meaning scheme which could have kick-started energy efficiency improvement, but it was strangled by red tape and ultimately abandoned within less than a year, having reached only a fraction of the homes it was expected to improve. With pleasure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my friend giving way. I wonder if you might just address the other point that the Honourable Lady, the Member for Brighton, mentioned, which is about community-led schemes. Isn't one of the issues why those costs are so high that government strategy is focused on individuals making the decision for their house rather than a more comprehensive approach that could achieve better economies of scale, certainly in terms of service delivery?
Well, I think what the Government has been doing is been focusing on social housing, which is typically owned in relatively large unit blocks together in a street or an estate, and that in many cases those schemes are community energy schemes. I've seen geothermal in my constituency, for example, being introduced across an entire estate. And we, as a committee, are indeed looking at the whole prospects for geothermal to provide community-based schemes. So I think there is a big role for this to play, but it's a part of the whole, and it won't be suitable for every area or every housing type. The Government is making steps towards resolving this, but I would see them as overly cautious. The one I welcome very strongly, however, was the Chancellor's announcement in the spring statement, which removed VAT on energy efficiency measures for domestic homes. And I expect ministers will be monitoring the impact that this has in the expectation that it will be a pathfinder to extensively rolling out similar support, for example, into batteries for domestic energy storage, which are currently excluded from the scheme, as I understand it. It's clear that the current energy cost crisis is leading to soaring public interest in energy efficiency measures to cut bills. This represents a real opportunity for a government willing to invest wisely for substantial returns, and not just to the exchequer, but returns both for the householder in cutting their bills and to the planet in reducing emissions. I do not expect the public sector to pick up the bill for energy efficiency improvements, but with the right support, the private sector can be properly incentivised to take the lead. So as I close, Mr Deputy Speaker, I just want to raise one further issue concerning the Government's approach to this energy efficiency issue and the funding of measures to improve it. I would like ministers to undertake a thorough review of the impediments to introducing innovative schemes which encourage home improvement. Just last week, I was alerted to an innovative domestic solar panel installer whose business model is being constrained by provisions of the Consumer Credit Act, designed to protect both consumers and suppliers from theft or loan default on portable consumer goods, such as cars. It seems problematic that these provisions should also apply to home insulation schemes, which are not portable, or if they are, they're very expensive to move, and therefore they're not a good asset on which to lend subject to these provisions. So I would strongly ask the ministers to examine issues like this with some urgency. And it may well be that an appropriate place for us to do so would be when the UK Infrastructure Bank Bill comes to this House, to ensure that the bank is not similarly hobbled in making investments in energy efficiency projects, which is one of its core remits, thanks to his department. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Deputy Speaker.
I anticipate the wind-ups to come round about 6:30, with 8 minutes for the SNP, 10 minutes each for the other two front benches, and then 2 minutes for Mr Dunne to briefly sum up. And if people keep their speeches to roughly about 10 minutes, then we should get everybody in equally. Mr. Jones.